All right, good afternoon, students. This video is going to be for chapters 1, 2, and 3 for the Crim 1 class 79312 at the Madera Community College. If you use the PowerPoints that are in Canvas, my suggestion to you is you use those and follow along because that is going to be the mechanism I use for this lecture. So you'll be able to follow along and be able to take notes using those PowerPoints. I would suggest that you print them out. As always, my suggestion also is to have read the text prior to engaging in these PowerPoints because some of the information may not have all the context it needs, and you'll get more specific information within the text. So that is something that I would suggest that you use. And as always, if you have any questions, issues, comments, or concerns, feel free to get a hold of me, and I'll do my best to help you walk through them. So anyway, chapter 1. We're going to start off with crime and criminal justice. So what is criminal justice? It's the government's mechanism of social control where law enforcement, the court, and corrections, they work together to effect apprehension, prosecution, and control of criminal offenders. Pretty self-explanatory, right? So we have police who wind up conducting an investigation. They conduct the arrest. That person, they did skip one component, and that would be corrections, but they go into a holding facility. That holding facility is there to make sure that they're held to account, they're held for trial. They go through the prosecution. If they're found guilty, they could wind up going back to another holding facility, prison, jail, or a lesser punishment, which would be like intermediate sanctions, and we'll get into those later. And that's where we're talking about the control of the criminal offender. So that's post-prosecution. The criminal justice system is charged with maintaining social order, enforcing the law, identifying individuals who break the law, bringing them to justice, and treating criminal behavior. So it's got a pretty broad requirement of what's needed with regard to the entire justice system. So we'll break those down. Social order. Well, social order starts essentially at the house, right? It's your parents telling you, don't do this, don't do that. You have to learn how to behave. So the mechanism that we have in our communities for social order is law enforcement. That's a primary one. There are others. We have school, you have churches, that kind of stuff. So anything that gives you a structure as to your obligation to behave a certain way within society, right? If we didn't have these constructs, then people would just basically do whatever they want. They'd be hedonists. They'd go out and do whatever they want. We still have those people, and that's what the criminal justice system is designed to do, is to take those people and hopefully through the process, one, move them away from the population that is obeying the law. Two, to try to convince them of their need to try to adapt to what the rules are, and number three, to punish them for their misbehavior. So the criminal justice process includes various criminal justice stages, including but not limited to investigation and arrest, prosecution, corrections, and release. And we talked a little bit about that a few seconds ago. So you're going to see in blue this thing called a CT questions. Some of the questions that are this PowerPoint and my lectures are pretty much set up originally for face-to-face classes, but we've had to make changes. So as a result of these requirements, the CT questions are there now to act as thought-provoking processes to help you understand what the entire idea of that PowerPoint or this portion of the lecture is talking about. So most of these CT questions, they don't have an absolute right or wrong answer. Some of them do. But there is an answer that's typically better than the other, right? So normally we would use these questions to start a class dialogue. Given the fact that we're not in an open classroom, we can't do that. So what I've done is some of the CT questions, I've incorporated those into your discussion questions. So if you see them here, you may wind up seeing them again in your discussion questions. So that might help you use your PowerPoints to help you navigate through some of your discussion questions. So in this case, CT questions, some of the criminal justice departments, name some of them and where they belong in relation to police, courts, and corrections. So if you're looking at police, some of the departments would be like the Federal Bureau of Investigations. That would be federal. For state, that would be your California Highway Patrol. For local law enforcement, counties being larger, you have sheriff's departments, and of course for police, that would be your city law enforcement. So that would be, in this case, Fresno PD or Madera PD. Courts, we have your federal courts, your highest court in the nation, which is the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS. If you hear SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, that's the acronym. And then it moves down from federal courts all the way down to state courts, and then down to municipal courts. And each one of these have a province that they control. And so we're talking about just criminal courts in this case, but we also have civil courts and a number of administrative courts as well. And then we have corrections, and so most people think of corrections as jail and prison, and those are the atypical ones. But corrections also encompasses community corrections, which would be probation and parole, and all the intermediate sanctions in between. So as of late, you're seeing a lot of corrections moving into the private industry, and that would be like drug treatment programs, residential and in custody drug treatment programs. And so some of these new programs and new approaches to corrections are there to try to assist the offender in doing away some of the bad behavior or their bad habits, and in adopting positive and good habits. Safe Street Acts. You will probably see this again. 1968 provided funding for Law Enforcement Assistant Administration, which granted hundreds of millions of dollars to aid and technical assistance to local, state, and law enforcement agencies. So before, and some people may think that this is a bad and good thing. That's a big debate that's been going on forever and ever. But prior to that, there was very little money moving from the federal government to the states, and ultimately from the states to the communities. And part of that was because states were sovereign, right? That's kind of how our entire political process works. Each state has its own rules and laws, and the union of all of these states agrees to act harmoniously under the Constitution of the United States. Well, and they did that because they really didn't want to have, the founders didn't want to have a policing federal government, right? We didn't want to have a huge police force. And part of that move, because the federal government does take in a significant amount of money via taxes and tariffs and everything else. So they moved, the Safe Street Acts was one of the first things that they used to bring money in. Well, whenever you get money from the government, there's always a condition imposed upon that. And in some cases, government started to encroach on the criminal justice system as a whole, federal government. So, and you're seeing that more and more, right? Drugs, like the war on drugs, that was a big thing, a big push during the 80s. And now you have DOJ, and then you have alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and all these things that were normally the province of state and local law enforcement that have been adopted by the federal government. Some people think that's a great idea. Others do not. And so it depends on what your perspective is, with regard to whether or not the government should be involved in this. Evidence-based justice is a use of the scientific method to determine whether criminal justice programs actually reduce crime and offender recidivism. So what is an evidence-based justice? Well, essentially evidence-based justice or evidence-based programs look at data results with regard to treatment or proactive policing. So they look at if there's a mechanism for changing law enforcement in one specific area, and they focus a specific type of service in one area, they're going to look to see whether or not that's had a positive or negative impact in crime itself, or law enforcement's ability to detect it and to stop it. And so the idea, as opposed to just having cops go random willy-nilly all over the place, has been moved from evidence-based practices. So as opposed to just having pretty much every cop do everything, an evidence-based practices, what they do is they look at the need of that community and the department tries to move towards that need. So, and you'll see that like in Madera, you'll see traffic cops, and you'll see cops within certain geographic regions of Fresno, Madera County, and those officers kind of know that area, so they work that specific area because they know the needs of that part of the community. All right, moving on to slide number 2. Let's see here. Okay, slide number 2. Contemporary criminal justice system, the concept of criminal justice is based on the idea of social control. So we talked about what is social control. Social control is the individual group behavior by control of individual and or group behavior by social and institutional forces in society, and we talked about some of those already. One of the CT questions, what behaviors are currently illegal and would you decriminalize, or currently illegal, would you decriminalize them and why? So there is a movement of people that believe that certain types of crimes, which are called public order crimes, and you'll see that later on in the chapters, basically address crimes that are crimes against the community, but not necessarily crimes against a person. So an example of that would be prostitution. That's the most common one, or drug use, another very common one. And there's arguments for and against criminalizing or decriminalizing those behaviors. So there is a pretty substantial argument. You may wind up seeing that again in some of your CT questions, or not CT questions, rather your discussion questions. Right now, there are more than 1,500 local, state, and county law enforcement agencies employing nearly 1.1 million people. California has a significant amount of those. Of those, 750,000 are full-time sworn peace officers, while the remainder are part-time peace officers and civilian employees, because obviously we need non-sworn staff as support staff to be able to move all this work through the entire system itself, right? A more comprehensive view of the criminal justice process includes the following. So you're going to see this again. So this is just a very broad-based view, and it steps on the initial contact all the way through the release. So when we're talking about one individual. So the initial contact, the investigation by the officer, the arrest, the placement into custody, the charging of that officer, the preliminary hearing, and or grand jury. Both of those two accomplish the same thing, but they use different mechanisms to do it. We'll get into that a little bit later. Arraignment, bail, and arraignment and bail sometimes are held at the same time. Plea bargaining, which essentially occurs throughout the entire process of charging all the way before trial. So, and that's a process where the defense and prosecution make a determination based off of a number of different factors, whether or not they're going to move forward with the case, to mitigate it or aggravate it based off of the circumstances of each case. Then trial, we go to sentencing. From sentencing, we go to appeal, and in certain cases, the appeal is automatic. And then we go to correctional treatment, which is basically incarceration. In correctional treatment, there's a pretty large range, obviously. So you have just in custody, you have intermediate sanctions, and then while you're in custody, there are levels of custody, which essentially will tamp down the movement of an inmate. So a person who's a level 1 inmate, they get free reign. Well, I won't say free reign, but they get a lot of latitude, versus a person who's a level 4 or might be in administrative segregation or security housing unit within the prison. And those individuals, their movement is controlled. And then you have release, which is an entire process in and of itself, and then post-release supervision, which also includes parole supervision, in some cases probation, but probation is generally one of the intermediate sanctions that's used during the sentencing process. So correctional treatment also falls into probation. All right, Number 3, so steps of the criminal justice process. So the in-presence requirement, and you'll see this again, is the requirement of a peace officer to have personally witnessed a misdemeanor crime, right? So you can't go up to a cop and say, I saw this person speeding and all this other stuff, and give them this information. The cop goes and makes the arrest, or does a citation, rather. Let's just say he does a citation or she does a citation and issues it to the person who's been accused. It's a pretty slam dunk case, right? Because you have a right, when you go to a trial, to face your accuser. And if that person does not go, then obviously it's pretty much a moot point. And so there is a requirement for a peace officer to have personally witnessed a crime, and in this case, misdemeanor. So nolle proseque is the Latin term meaning unwilling to pursue. And I know that kind of sounds like you're talking about a cop making a decision not to do something, but it has to do with prosecution. So this is where the prosecutor decides to drop a case as a result of a number of different things. So it could be insufficient evidence, investigative error, cops not doing the report correctly, or tampering with evidence, or there's not a correct chain of evidence, or any number of these errors. A reluctant witness, or a witness who recants. So you'll have one who's like, oh, my husband beat me, or my wife beat me. That does happen. And the witness recants later on down the line and goes, well, he was just angry, or she was just angry. They had a bad day at work. The kids spilled milk on the floor, or whatever it was. And so if you have that reluctant witness, there is a chance that that individual is not going to move forward with that charge. And/or office policy. So there may be some cases, you've probably heard lately in Los Angeles, the district attorney there has put his foot down on a number of different prosecutions, and I don't personally agree with them, but that office policy says that, you know what, I'm making a decision, we're not going to follow through with these cases. Grand jury is responsible for investigating alleged crime and issuing indictments. You're going to see this again. So remember, we talked about a grand jury. The opposite end is I just lost my train of thought here. On the backside of that, you're talking about the come on, Myron. Well, anyway, we'll talk about the grand jury. Grand jury is convened, and they are responsible for investigating an alleged crime, right? So as opposed to the district attorney making the decision, a grand jury is convened to make that decision, and they do that. The courts will do that at times, or the prosecutors will defer to a grand jury when there could be a perceived conflict of interest, right? Because they want to make sure that there's everything's above board. So a grand jury, they're responsible for investigating an alleged crime. They have the power to subpoena through the court, and they can come up with two things. So they either come up with a true bill of indictment, and that's a written statement that specifies the exact charges on which the accused must stand trial. And that's what I was getting at, was the probable cause. So a probable cause is where probable cause or preliminary hearing is where they make a determination that if there's enough evidence to bring a case to trial, and that goes through the prosecution. So those two things, a grand jury or probable cause preliminary hearing, those are where the prosecutor makes a determination as to whether or not a case is going to go forward. All right. Slide number 4, informal criminal justice process. The informal criminal justice process follows the same 15 stages of the formal criminal justice process. However, it allows for diversion. And diversion is the idea of moving a case outside the formal process to minimize the detrimental impact it could have to a defendant. And they believe, either law enforcement or whoever believes, that this is in their best interest and will still solve or still address the issue of accountability for whatever they've done. So an example that's posted is if a police officer arrests someone for possession of a controlled substance, the officer may decide not to file a formal charge if the arrestee is willing to provide information for future criminal conduct. And I know that's kind of a weird, whatchamacallit. You'll see a lot of diversion within the juvenile justice, criminal justice system. So a lot of times, especially with youthful offenders, extremely youthful offenders, ones that might have been convinced to do it by their peers or older young adults. Sometimes those offenders will be diverted out to a different path to minimize the stigma of an actual conviction. Of the informal criminal justice process, one of the informal criminal justice processes is called the wedding cake model of justice. So you'll see that again. And so the idea of the wedding cake model of justice was founded by Samuel Walker, a justice historian and scholar who noted there are 4 levels to the informal justice process. The first level is made up of celebrated cases that get national media attention. Most notably, even today, and it happened years ago, is the OJ case, right? So those cases, and what they're talking about is the level of involvement by the defense and the prosecution, the amount of investment, not just money, but time in those cases, right? So you had, if you take a look, if you recall, the prosecution had like 3 or 4 prosecutors that were there. The defense had 3 or 4 defense attorneys that were there. And there was a lot of media attention, and there's a number of things that were going on with regard to those cases. So that's the first level. Second level would be serious and violent felonies, ones that are, you catch the public eye, but they aren't to the same level of a celebrated case. And they may be more localized. Third level are ones that are less serious felony crimes committed by low-level offenders. These are atypical crimes, and they're often pled out for a lower-level sentence. So these are the cases that plea bargaining basically rules the day, and that's the bulk of all the cases that are heard and seen by the courts. The fourth level, which is the last level of that wedding cake, is made up of misdemeanor crimes that typically result in a fine or probation. In those cases, they'll have their their day in court, and sometimes it'll be right then, and they'll go through the sentencing process so they can expedite those cases, because there's quite a few of them. Okay, criminal justice perspectives. So crime control, you'll see these again, so you'll need to know them. Criminal justice perspectives. The first one is a crime control perspective, and that's a model of criminal justice that emphasizes control of dangerous offenders and the protection of society. Those who commit crimes are apprehended, they're tried, and they're punished so that they never commit crimes again. The idea there is basically punishment, right? They want to impose a punishment, and hopefully the punishment is severe enough that it will change a person's behavior. So what model of sociology does that fall under? Well, that would fall under general deterrence, right? So general deterrence, and in this case for the individual would be specific deterrence. So they're trying to essentially control people by letting them know, hey, you know what, you do this, you're going to go to prison, you're going to go to jail, you're going to be tried, and hopefully you never do this again. And that specific deterrence is the deterrence or the idea that you suffer the punishment, and hopefully that suffering will convince you that the perceived benefit of committing the crime is not there anymore. The rehabilitationist perspective use crime as an expression of frustration and anger created by social inequality. The idea is that crime can be controlled by giving people the means to improve their lifestyle by criminal justice programs. So what they're saying is that if a person has lived a very poor life, they don't have a lot of opportunities, that is the primary motivator for engaging in criminal behavior. And if we move resources to these areas, that crime can be controlled. And to a certain extent, I would agree with that. However, the failing there is we also see that there is a number of criminals that we call white-collar criminals, right, who are very affluent or well-to-do. Some people would even argue that much of our politicians are white-collar criminals. But in that idea, these people aren't disadvantaged. They don't suffer any social inequality, yet they still involve themselves in criminal behavior. So this rehabilitation perspective only works for a select component of people, or select group of people, rather. Due process perspective is a criminal justice idea that is dedicated to providing a fair and equitable treatment to all people accused of a crime. So essentially, it's exactly what it says it is, right? They look at case factors and cases that are similarly situated. They look at the punishments for those people who are found guilty of that and try to mirror those punishments so that there is no excessive punishment and there is no punishment that doesn't, is underwhelming or underdeserved, right? I mean, because we have to look at the victims sometimes in these cases, and a lot of people look at them on some of these really heinous crimes. But let's look at it from a very first person and third person. So let's say that at third person you heard that somebody had their house broken into, and you feel bad for them, but it wouldn't be something that is like, oh my God, this person should do a lot of time because they broke into a house. But if you're first person, if you're the victim, and let's say that individual went in and not only stole food and money, but they took something that was emotionally special to you, like maybe a grandmother passed down a ring to you, and or a necklace, or whatever, or an Xbox game that was given to you by a grandparent or a best friend, or those kind of things, and they have emotional significance. They have personal significance, and those individuals will be like, wait a minute, this is wrong. So there's kind of an area of due process perspective where sometimes while you're trying to make the shoe fit every foot is, no matter what, is going to be a little bit different. Non-intervention perspective believes that criminal justice agencies should limit their involvement with the criminal defendants. So what they're dealing with there is they're talking about, like, police, the courts and corrections would have limited amount of influence with regard to the offender, and most of it would go up to or back to the community. So you'd have more community involvement as opposed to criminal justice agencies dealing. So the state wouldn't be dealing with it. You'd have more pre-criminal programs. So like if you're dealing with youth, you'd have youth centers, you'd have Boys and Girls Club, you'd invest in those kind of things. And post, you'd invest in job placement programs and that kind of stuff for the non-intervention perspective. Next one is equal justice perspective, is the idea that the American criminal justice system is currently dispensing sentencing and punishment inequally and inconsistently. It's supposed to be inequally. Equality may best be achieved through individual discretion in the justice process. And so much like the due process perspective that looks to equalize everything, the equal criminal justice perspective wants to take the idea of criminal justice and look at it as on a case-by-case basis. The problem with that, I mean, it's a good thing because all cases should be case-by-case, but perception could be, if one person gets off, a lot of times the general public won't know that reason why, and perspective could be introduced into that process as well. And the last one is restorative justice, and that perspective views the cruel justice system should promote, or the criminal justice system says cruel rather, criminal justice system should promote peaceful and a just society which advocates peaceful solutions and mediation rather than course of punishment. So restorative essentially means that an individual, and you probably will remember this from school, especially elementary school, where you get into a fight with another student, and your teacher goes, oh, well, you know what, we need to get you to talk it out and to find out the core cause of why you guys got into a fight. and to resolve it, peacefully through mediation, right? And so the idea there is that restorative justice would bring the offender and the victim together, and so the victim would see into the mind of the individual who committed the crime, and then vice versa. So the criminal could look at it from the eyes of the victim and see how they did harm. The issue with that, though, is those kind of ideas do work, but they work in small settings, much like a school, right? Because if Johnny and Joey are playing together every day, and they have a spat, and we put them together, there is some kind of an emotional tie there. But when you're talking about the macro, when you're talking about an entire society, is there really going to be any connective tissue between the criminal and the victim, who that person may not even know? They're just there. And so the idea of restorative justice would work. I just think it would work in significantly smaller, more compact situations. All right, number 6, and the last one for chapter 1, this is ethics. So ethics in the criminal justice system is very important because of the power granted to those who work within that system. Law enforcement has the power and authority to deprive people of liberty and property, which is guaranteed to all citizens under the Bill of Rights. And you'll see this again. Due process is the fundamental mechanism of oversight in the application of the criminal justice in America. So basically what they're saying is, in order for me to take away your liberty, which is basically your freedom, or to remove property from you, there has to be a mechanism that allows for your rights as an American to be recognized and upheld. There are certain things that government cannot do to prove that you have committed a crime, and those things are part of due process. During the court process, prosecutors must share evidence with the defense, and this is some of the ideas of due process. They must not use scare tactics or intimidation, and they must represent the public interest. Further, because of the large caseloads, prosecutors are often pressured to settle cases via plea deals, which we talked about earlier, which creates an ethical dilemma, given that the guilty party is allowed to escape, I know it says state, the full extent of the law. So in some cases, it allows for the person who committed the crime to get a much lesser sentence. But it does sometimes work in the inverse, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Corrections also have ethical issues to deal with when executing the law. Should offenders be given different punishment for the same criminal law violation? Should correctional officers, because correctional officers have a lot of power over offenders, their liberty, a prison violation report, which is essentially a incident report or arrest report for misconduct, may cause the denial of parole for an offender. And specifically here in California, it could add time. Inmates are given time, good conduct credit, and we could take away that good conduct credit, which can add time to their prison stay. So those are some of the mechanisms that are used for what's the word I'm trying to look for dealing with the inmate population. Okay, I'm going to pause this just for a hot second here. I believe it is option. No, I guess I'm not going to pause it. It's not going to allow me to. So we're going to go ahead directly into chapter 2 as soon as I get that loaded. And give me one hot second here. Okay, so chapter 2 slide. So what is crime? and who decides. So the simplest definition of crime is the violation of law, right? But who decides that? What decides what type of behaviors qualify as crime? There's currently three views of how and why some behaviors are illegal and considered crime while others are not. The consensus view, and so you're going to see these again, all right? The consensus view of crime looks at behaviors that are harmful to the majority of citizens living in the society and therefore need to be controlled or prohibited by criminal law. Criminal law expresses the norms, goals, and values of the vast majority of society. So if I were to break that down, essentially what that means is they look at a certain behavior and what is the likelihood of the outcome of that behavior, and if the outcome could result in injury to the community, then it's a mechanism for control, right? A really easy one would be driving while under the influence of alcohol. So can you drive under the influence of alcohol? Well, yeah, there's a specific BAC or blood alcohol content that's below the minimum before you're held criminally accountable, where you would be, I don't want to say okay, but you wouldn't suffer the full extent of the law. And then, of course, once you get up to a certain amount, then you would. And why did they do that? Well, they found that people who are severely inebriated have a higher incidence of automobile accidents, and in many of those cases, they're severe, which could lead to high property and or losses of life, high property losses or losses of life. So that's the idea behind controlling a type of behavior. The conflict view of crime represents a conflict between the rich and powerful with the poor and underrepresented. And so the law is controlled by the rich, who shape the content to ensure their continued economic domination within society. So this idea is that all of the affluent people, business, politicians, that kind of stuff, movie makers, they're the ones who are controlling how the law is not only drafted but applied. And in some cases you can see that, right? You can see that like big companies like the air industry, for airplanes, TWA, and well, they're gone now, but you get the Southwest. So a lot of them were involved with the making of some of these rules just by virtue of their donations to their representatives, and those donations were used, and they're like, okay, so it's kind of a tit for tat kind of a thing, and so a lot of people see that, and that's where they get that conflict view of crime. And then the third one is the interactionist view of crime, and that's criminal law is structured to reflect the preferences and opinions of people who hold social power, and that would be politicians and the moral majority. And they use their influence to shape the legal process. The people sometimes called the moral entrepreneurs initiate campaigns to control behaviors they view as wrong, or they promote ones that reflect their own personal values. And staying with that same theme that we talked about with regard to the consensus view, drinking, in this case, moral entrepreneurs could be like MAD, right? Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. So they utilize their influence to push politicians to draft laws to make sure that people, the people who engage in drinking and driving were held to a higher account. That was one of the mechanisms that was used. So again, these three: consensus view, conflict view, and interactionist view, you're definitely going to see again. All right, moving on to number 2. So official crime measurement. There is mechanisms that we measure crime with, and they are official data, victim data, and then self-report data. And there's primary ones for each one of these areas. Each one. So we're gonna talk about official data first. And official data is monitored and controlled by the FBI, and that's called the Uniform Crime Report, or UCR. And it's a yearly publication of where, when, and how much serious crime occurred in the prior year. And these are considered official crime statistics by the FBI. And the UCR, they tally those serious crimes reported to the police, reported by the police agencies each year. So the UCR has two major components to it. Serious and violent crimes, which the FBI identifies as Part 1 crimes, and these include murder, non-negligent manslaughter, forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, theft, motor vehicle theft, and arson. And then we'll go through each one of those. So murder, non-negligent manslaughter defined as willful killing of another human being. Forcible rape defined as a penetration, no matter how slight, of the sex organ by another person without the consent of the victim. And we can go through each one of those. But I would suggest you do that on your own time. That is the definition that the FBI uses for the Part 1 crimes, or you'll also see Type 1 crimes. So if you see Part 1 or Type 1, they're talking about these serious and violent crimes within the UCR. So other crimes that are listed by the UCR are considered Part 2 or Type 2 crimes, and the FBI records all arrests made for Part 2 crimes, including demographics like race, gender, and age information. So Part 1 and Part 2, or Type 1 and Type 2. So how accurate is the UCR? And then we're on slide number 3 now. Well, it's pretty accurate, but there are some issues with it. It's a really valuable tool in the measurement of crime, but there are some issues with the accuracy. Many serious crimes are not reported to the police and therefore not counted by the UCR, right? So we know that some people will not call law enforcement. They'd rather deal with it themselves. And even though the crime happened, we don't have any record of it actually happening. How many times have you seen a victim of domestic violence contact law enforcement and say that their significant other is beating them, doing this, doing that, and they've got like 20 different instances of that happening, but law enforcement doesn't have any record of it because it's never been reported. So this person allowed those behaviors to occur until they couldn't deal with it anymore. And that's one of the issues with UCR. The UCR also has a hierarchy rule. And essentially what that means is, if we all know that when a crime is committed, there are multiple components to the crime. Like, say, for instance, a person went in, they drove up to a convenience store, pulled out a gun, demanded money, they retrieved the money, stole a 6-pack of beer, ran out of the store, jumped back into the car, sped away, went through 3 red lights, and then hit another parked car, and law enforcement came up and then captured them. So we have a number of issues, right? We have that they brandished a weapon, that they robbed somebody. We also have burglary. We have, shoplifting. You have multiple vehicle violations. However, in that entire incident, the UCR only records the one crime that is considered the most serious. So in this case, that would likely be the robbery, right? Using the firearm, the robbery. In an attempt to redesign UCR, back in 1982, a new data gathering program was initiated. And this program, also by the FBI, is called the National Incident-Based Reporting System, NIBRS. So NIBRS gathers all the data currently compiled in the UCR. However, it includes a brief account of each incident and arrest. It does not have a hierarchy rule as well. And it also gets information from the victim as well as the offender. It also includes data on terrorism. It also includes data on white-collar crime. The UCR does not. Assaults on peace officers. And the UCR does deal with assaults on peace officers, but in a separate section. It also deals with gang-related crime, juvenile crime, parental abduction, and organized crime. And as of 2015, a little over 6,600 law enforcement agencies submitted data to NIBRS, and it's slated to replace UCR, was slated to replace UCR as of 2021. That at this point has not happened. So the UCR is still in effect, and honestly, I don't know whether or not it's actually ever going to replace, but more agencies are submitting information to NIBRS in lieu of the UCR. And so, we were talking about moving data from one database to another database, and that's going to be a pretty huge undertaking. All right, victim data. So we talked about originally offender data, right? We said that, or rather official data. So and the next one is victim data. So victim data don't report their experiences to the police. The UCR can't give an accurate measurement, right? NIBRS can, but it's also very limited. So in order to rectify this issue, the National Crime Victim Survey, the NCVS report was born. NCVS is a national survey compiled by the U.S. Census Bureau, not law enforcement, of approximately 90,000 households, which is used to estimate the frequency of crime victimization as well as the characteristics of the victim. The advantages of NCVS over UCR is that it can estimate the total amount of annual crimes and not just those reported to the police. So sometimes it will capture those crimes that we talked about a few minutes ago where an individual isn't going to be forthcoming with regard to that criminal behavior. Some of the disadvantages of NCVS are over-reporting, so people embellishing. He beat me 55 times. That may or may not have happened. Sometimes we do find it, and that's the consequence of misinterpretation of events. The victim may underreport because they're embarrassed, right? You oftentimes will get, and staying with the domestic violence theme, if you get domestic violence by a female, oftentimes you're going to get over-reporting. But if the domestic violence where the victim is a male, you may not get all of the information. You might not get any. You might have situations where, in this case, like it's noted, the victim is embarrassed because, that's not atypical behavior. So there's also fear of getting into trouble, especially when you're dealing with juveniles. They take this information from the juveniles, and they're worried that while I might not get in trouble with law enforcement, I could definitely get in trouble with my parents. And so they don't engage, or they simply forgot about the incident. So sampling errors may not give a true representation of as a whole on the questions. Of format may invalidate some of the responses. However, it does give a picture. All right. And so the next one, the last one we talked about was self-reporting. And this last measure of crime is the self-report survey. And these are used mainly in schools as well as prisons and jails. So the self-report survey is issued to students and incarcerated offenders to ask them about their current and past criminal activities, including whether or not they've been involved in like substance abuse, petty crime, petty property crime, and or violence, and how often they engage in those activities and what type of drugs that they took and whether or not they acted alone and in groups. And they compile that information as well. And while some of the information that they capture is really useful, the questions do remain regarding the validity of self-report surveys. How reasonable is it to expect that people are going to be candid about their illegal criminal acts that they've engaged in? And again, we talked about, like for students, while some of them may not be held criminally responsible, they could be worried about how their parents or their peers are going to view them. It's also unknown whether or not their answers are embellished or the facts are minimized. Either way. So if you take a look at all three of these, you have the official data, victim data, and self-report data. And on all three of those things, we have individuals that were, or rather reporting systems that don't quite capture all of it. So oftentimes, to get a complete picture, all three of these reporting systems are used. So slide number 6, crime trends. Trends in the UCR and NCBS show an overall decline in violent crime and property crime victimization from 93 to 2015. However, self-report data trends, one of the most important data sources, monitoring the future study found that a large number of teenagers have been involved in serious criminal behavior. A study that involved about 40 or 50,000 high school students found that approximately 10% So 10% of 40 to 50,000, we're talking about 4 or 5,000 students, reported hurting someone badly enough that the victim needed medical care. 22%, so you're talking about 8 to 10,000 or up to 12,000 reported stealing something worth less than $50. I'm sure that's more today because, take a look at cellular phones, right? I mean, some of them nowadays are right around the price of a computer. And about 1.3 of high school students claimed they had to use force to steal, which is the legal definition of robbery. So criminology experts have identified a variety of social, economic, and personal and demographic factors that influence crime rate trends. You'll see this again. So what are some of these things that are influencing crime specifically in teenagers? And their age, immigration status, unemployment, abortion, gun availability, mental health treatment availability, gangs, drug use, the media, medical technology, and the current criminal justice policy. So those are areas, and you will likely see that again, that criminologists, experts have identified that are influencing crime and the rate of crime. All right, number 7, crime patterns. There are a number of different patterns that influence the crime rate. Ecological suggests that the crime is more rampant in inner cities than it is in rural and suburban rural. It's supposed to be rural and suburban areas, not world. And you can just look at that just at face value, right? If you have a bunch of people in a really small area, the opportunity for criminal behavior is enhanced versus, in rural or suburban areas, especially like in farm areas. Sometimes some of these houses are, a mile or two apart, and so the likelihood is less that you're going to have, especially property crime and violent one-on-one crime, because there's not a lot of interaction, right? Crime rates are also higher in the summer months. That's pretty self-explanatory, especially out here. Gender patterns also have an influence. Male crime rates are significantly higher than females in violent crime, about 8 to 1. Racial patterns also show a disproportionate share of criminal activity for certain minority racial groups. And for instance, African Americans make up approximately 30% of the population, yet account for 36% of all arrests for Part 1 crimes, and remember that's the UCR, violent crimes, and 28% for Part 2, or property crimes. Social class patterns also identified economic patterns that show the highest crime rates are found in the highest deprived inner city areas. That, too, again, is kind of slanted because in a lot of cases, white collar crime isn't, pardon me, I'm sorry about that. White collar crime isn't reported because it is easier and more expeditious to try to get the losses recovered by the offender than it is to go through the criminal justice process. So in some cases, you're going to see even underreporting of white-collar crime. Age patterns reveal that younger people are arrested at a rate disproportionate to the numbers in the general population. Career patterns also show that chronic criminal offenders usually begin their criminal behavior at a younger age, and they escalate that. And that's a result of being desensitized to the punishment in the criminal justice system, right? So first time you do something and you get punished, they're afraid and they're scared. They get used to that. They get released, and they're like, it wasn't that bad. My friends were there, so on and so forth. And it becomes easier and easier for them to engage that because it's not different anymore. Victim patterns also influence crime in that gender, age, race, income, and repeat victimization influence the type and frequency of crime. So who is more likely to get victimized for property and or violent crime? We're going to have people who are aloof, not paying attention to their environment, people who are not strong, don't have the means to defend themselves, that kind of stuff. So all of those components play in. All right, number 8, definitions. You're going to need to know these. So racial profiling definition, the practice of police targeting minority groups because of the belief that they're more likely to engage in criminal behavior. So that's racial profiling. That would be akin to going to certain areas where you expect a certain type of crime to be being committed. Racial threat hypothesis is the view that the percentage of minorities in the population shapes the level of police activity. They're saying there that a certain amount of minorities within that population is going to be engaged in certain types of criminal behavior, and that criminal behavior is going to be met with a level of police activity that can control. Relative deprivation. So that view, the view that extreme social and economic differences of people living in the same community exacerbates criminal activity. Essentially, the more poor people you have, the more criminal activity you're going to have. All right. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, only because you have individuals who are very poor. Let's take a look at the Appalachian Mountains, for instance. Small communities out there, but they have good family units. They have, they go to church. So a number of the social practices offset the economic and social inequities that they have to suffer, and as a result, their criminal activity is lower. I'm not saying it's not there, but it is lower. One of the theories under relative deprivation is the broken windows theory. You're going to see this again, and that's the theory that deteriorated communities serve as a magnet for criminal activity. We see that on a regular basis. So houses that have graffiti and everything all on them, generally speaking, transients move there. Generally, some of those transients either have mental health issues or are chemically dependent. So that brings in drug dealers, that brings in gangs, and et cetera, et cetera. So the broken windows theory is the idea that if we can minimize those areas, then we also minimize the amount of criminal activity in them. Chronic offender, and that's an offender who has a serious and persistent contact with law enforcement. They built a career in crime, and their behavior is currently violent and destructive. So chronic means ongoing. Acute means it's happening right now, right? So a chronic offender, this is one that is persistent. They started young, and they're moving up, and generally speaking, they're not just moving up, but their severity and intensity is also moving up as well. All right, crime causes. Although the nature of crime can be defined through social process, the cause of crime is a little bit more different. So there are different types of theories as to why crime actually happens. So one of the first ones that was introduced was called the rational choice theory, and that says that people will engage in criminal behavior after weighing the consequence and benefits of that behavior. So it's essentially a personal choice. In other words, they make a conscious choice to decide. So it's in the same vein as we talked about earlier. How it's corrected is general deterrence. And that theory notes that crime is influenced and controlled by the threat of punishment throughout the community. And specific deterrence is similar to general deterrence, but it's for the individual themselves. So that would be like for me. General deterrence, community. Specific deterrence, me. And rational choice says that I weigh the pros and cons of doing it, and then go, if I just go to prison or jail, not a big deal. If I get away with it, awesome. All right, so biosocial theory notes that human behavior is a function of interaction between biochemical, neurological, genetic factors with environmental stimuli. It's the idea that brain chemistry and or genetic factors are linked to these chronic disorders, which contributes to a pattern of negative behavior where social norms are violated. So they're saying that a person's body chemistry plays a huge role, or the primary role, in whether or not a person is going to engage in criminal behavior. And we've seen that, right? People who have cognitive issues or have mental health issues have a tendency to engage in a destructive behavior, self-destructive behavior, and a lot of that is exacerbated by the environment that they're in. Psychological theory knows that criminality is caused by psychological factors, not just biosocial. such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, antisocial behaviors, mood disorders, and they also fall under the psychological theory that includes social learning, which is the theory that behavior patterns are modeled and learned through interactions of others, right? So I'm sure you've seen or heard this before. The father who was beat as a child will tend to beat their children because that was how they were brought up, and they rationalize that they were good people, so that is the mechanism that they need to use that will also guarantee that they will raise good people as well. Cognitive theory notes that people suffering a psychological disorder view crime as an appropriate means to satisfy their immediate personal need, right? And so that's basically saying that I want what I want now, and I don't really care who or what is affected by my desire. That's a hedonistic idea. Personality theory notes that some individuals are not capable of learning from their experiences or punishment, and as a result they engage in these callous, and that's a misspelling, sorry, and hedonistic behaviors with little to no empathy. So essentially it's much like cognitive theory, but it's saying that even certain punishments or punishments in and of themselves won't change their behavior. And so we have to try to look at other mechanisms to make those changes in the behavior. So now let's move to social theories. And the social theory is essentially that what makes people behave as a group the way they behave. I mean, some of you have seen or heard of the exercise. We're all standing around, and then one person looks up, and they're looking up at the sky, and then shortly thereafter, you're going to see a lot of people looking up as well, right? So in this case, social structure theory believes that society in the United States is stratified. So what that means, they took that word from the Greek strata, which means layers, right? It's used in geology. So you have layers, and these layers are classes. So that means that there are classes of people that are assigned to different levels, layers, where the rich and affluent are at the top level, and the poor and marginalized are at the bottom. So all the pressure's on these people. And these lower level peoples are more likely to succumb to criminality versus those at the top, given their economic advantage. And we do see that, but we also see the inverse. So social structure theory makes sense in some instances, but not in every one. Strain theory notes that all people have common and social and economic goals. However, they do not have the same ability to obtain these goals. As a result, frustration and resentment reflect strain, which makes them more susceptible to criminal behavior. So, and you see that a lot with individuals who are released from prison. They have every single goal. It's like as a counselor, when I was there, I used to see them, Miss G. Brown, I'm going to get my ID, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And then they find the stresses of undergoing and doing all those things too much. They get mad, and then they go back to what's comfortable to them, criminal behavior. Cultural deviance theory combines elements of both strain and social disorder, where a unique lower-class culture is developed in disorganized, poverty-ridden neighborhoods, and their criminal behavior is an expression of conformity to that lower-class culture. So gang members having a family after a person leaves their own family. If you watched... I'm trying to think of the movie American Me is a good example of gang members becoming a family after the people leave their own family because they couldn't find what they needed, right? And they were looking for respect, and that's where they got it within those gang members, not necessarily the family, because in the strata of the family, they're kids, and obviously they're not going to get respect because that's where mom and dad are at. Social process theory is the theory of individual behavior being shaped by the interactions they have with the established social institutions, such as family, school, and peer. It's supposed to be peer groups, not pure groups. So social process theory works off the idea of social bonds, which are emotional ties that people have to these social institutions. Social process theory is the idea that everything that a person goes through in their lives that actually is interaction with established social institutions is what is going to shape them, either good or bad. Schools, churches. And people go, well, schools and churches are good things. Well, it depends on what your perspective is within that school or church. Ask yourself, if you were going to church on a regular basis and you were being abused by either other members of the clergy and or other members in the congregation, would you have a really good belief or really strong belief that church was actually good? So everyone's exposures are going to be different, and that's going to those exposures are going to create emotional ties to the people there as well as to those institutions, and that's going to be the mechanism that is used to determine whether or not these people are going to be good people or bad people. Social conflict theory is the theory of human behavior that is shaped by interpersonal conflict and those who maintain social power in that relationship to further their own interests. So essentially what they're saying there is that, and you see this really among men, if you look at a schoolyard, you see the one person who's generally athletic, good looking, or maybe very smart is the one that controls what's going on in that group. And then those other kids kind of fall in line based on the social power that they maintain in the relationship of that group. And they're going to utilize that power to further their own interests, right? In the social conflict theory, those in power control the content and direction of that criminal justice system. All right. And then the last slide in Chapter 2, developmental theory, and that's the theory of social interactions better developed over the life course of a person is shaping their behavior, also known as life course theory. And some of these interactions may encourage law violations that may help people desist from crime. So some people, their life course may cause them to involve themselves in criminal behavior. Other ones, it may cause them to step away from criminal behavior. That's life course theory, and that focuses on the changes of criminality over the life course, and that's brought about by shifts in experience and life events. So as a parole agent and as a correctional officer, you'll see that we often will use the term timing out as an idea of life course theory. In other words, this person has went through so many different ins and outs of the criminal justice system, and eventually they're just like, you know what, I've learned as a result of all these experiences that crime isn't gonna pay for me. Cumulative disadvantage is the tendency of a prior social problem or problems to produce the future ones that accumulate, making it more difficult to succeed over time. The idea of quicksand. Okay, so if you take quicksand and you're in quicksand, you start to sink really slowly, but if you start struggling, you seem to sink a little bit faster, right? And so as these problems get more and more and they start to accumulate, you start to sink faster and over a period of time. It makes it more difficult for you to succeed and then change those behaviors. So cumulative disadvantages, like an example would be you lost your driver's license because you went out drinking and got your second DUI, which caused you to lose your job, which caused you to lose your house, which caused you to lose your wife, which caused you to lose, and you kind of get the idea. The propensity theory is the view that stable, unchanging personal features and characteristics such as defective intelligence or impulse behavior issues make some people more prone to crime. And you can kind of see that, when you're talking about individuals that have mental health issues and or cognitive disabilities. Those individuals, and cognitive disabilities could be hereditary or it could be brought on by a trauma. So, if you were a kid and you're riding your bike and you fell off your bike and you hit your head and all of a sudden you didn't have the means to retain memory and you required help doing things, you can see a person's defective intelligence and their ability to control their behaviors could cause them to lash out, and obviously that some of those lashing outs may be criminal. Latent trait theory suggests that human development is controlled by a master hidden trait that guides all human behavior, and those would be needs and wants, right? So no matter what happens, these traits are what is making us behave a certain way within that society. That's latent trait theory. And then trajectory theory, the last one, is a view that there are multiple independent paths to a career criminal, as well as to a non-criminal lifestyle, and different types and classes of these offenders. In other words, we can't catalog or categorize everyone the exact same way no matter what, because again, we talked about that earlier in this theory, that everything is kind of a case by case. There are different motivations. There may be similar criminality, but there are different motivations that cause that criminality. All right, that about does it for chapters 1 and 2. I think I'm going to stop here, and then I'll start chapters 3 and 4 in the next lecture video. If you have any questions, issues, comments, or concerns with regard to the content of this video, obviously please hit me up, and we will see you on chapter 3. Have a great day. Bye-bye now.